She gave a dying Apache a sip of water. The next morning, 50 warriors surrounded her ranch. In a land where kindness could get you killed, Hannah Moore made a choice that would change everything. Stay with us to hear the unforgettable story of courage, betrayal, and an unexpected bond that defied an entire town. The land was dry, cracked like broken porcelain under the merciless sun. The air shimmered with heat, and the only sounds were the brittle whisper of dying grass and the lonely cry of a hawk circling far above. Hannah Moore adjusted the straw hat on her head and wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. Her shirt clung to her skin, and her boots kicked up little clouds of dust with each weary step. The ranch stretched before her, a patch of stubborn survival against a world that seemed determined to see her fail. The well was nearly dry, the fields were barren, and the fences sagged like tired old men ready to collapse. She had been up since before dawn, wrestling with a broken fence post, praying the last of the well water would stretch until tomorrow. Each creak of wood under her hands, each drop of sweat rolling down her spine, whispered the same bitter truth. There wasn't much left. Not of the water, not of her money, and, increasingly, not of her will. This land was all she had left. James had died the previous winter, taken by a fever that no doctor could name and no preacher could pray away. The town of Dry Hollow had buried him quickly, and forgotten him even quicker. They had looked at Hannah with the same tired, wary eyes they reserved for women who didn't know their place. Too young to be a widow, too stubborn to remarry, too foolish to leave. She lived a mile out from town, past the scraggly mesquite trees, where only the desperate or the foolhardy built their homes. Some days, Hannah wasn't sure which one she was. The wind shifted, bringing with it the sharp, metallic scent of dust and something else. Something faintly sour and wrong. Hannah straightened slowly, her muscles aching from the morning's work. A buzzard circled high overhead, slow and lazy, and a flicker of unease prickled the back of her neck. She turned toward the ridge behind the barn, squinting against the harsh glare of the sun. At first, she thought it was a bundle of blankets left behind by travelers, or perhaps some debris blown in from the last storm. But as she stepped closer, her breath caught in her throat. It was a man. He lay crumpled on his side, chest rising faintly, blood soaking the earth around him until the dirt cracked and darkened like old rust. His long black hair was tangled with dust and sweat, his deerskin shirt torn open at the shoulder to reveal a deep, raw wound. Bone gleamed white beneath shredded flesh. Around his neck, a beaded necklace with a single feather swung limply with each shallow breath. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Every warning she had ever heard as a child came rushing back. Stories of Apache raids, of farms burned to the ground, of children stolen from their beds, warnings whispered from pulpit and saloon alike. Never trust a savage, never show mercy. She took a step back, then another. Her fingers itched toward the rifle, leaning uselessly against the porch, but then the man groaned, a low, pained sound that barely stirred the dust, and tried, unsuccessfully, to lift his head. He wasn't a threat, he was dying, and he would die here, alone and forgotten if she left him. Hannah glanced around. The road was empty. Dry Hollow was 2 miles away, and even if she ran, no one would come. The town wouldn't care if a wounded Apache bled into the earth. They might even prefer it. She should walk away. She knew that it would be safer, smarter, expected. Instead, she turned back toward the barn, her heart pounding, her boots thudding hollowly against the dry earth. Moments later, she returned with a dented tin cup filled with the last of her precious well water. She knelt beside the man, the cup shaking slightly in her hands. She didn't speak, didn't ask his name or his tribe. She simply lifted his head with trembling fingers and pressed the cup to his lips. At first, he didn't respond. His eyes flickered open, dark, wild, unreadable, and fixed on hers. Still she waited. After a long moment, his lips parted slightly and he drank, just a sip, enough to wet his cracked mouth, enough to prove he was still clinging to life. When he finished, she set the cup down and carefully lowered his head back to the ground. She stood up, her legs trembling beneath her. For a heartbeat, she thought he might grab her hand or speak or curse her in a language she didn't understand. Instead, he simply closed his eyes and exhaled, a sound almost like peace. Hannah turned and walked slowly back toward the house. Each step away from him felt heavier, like wading through deep mud. She didn't know if she had just saved a life or invited death to her doorstep. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the window, the unloaded rifle across her lap, listening to every creak and whisper of the night. Her eyes burned with exhaustion, but she couldn't rest. Every story she had ever heard spun through her mind like a ghost. Stories of mercy repaid with betrayal, of kindness turned into bloodshed. Just before dawn, a sound rumbled through the stillness. Not thunder from the sky, but thunder from the ground. Hannah stood slowly, heart hammering in her chest, and moved to the porch. In the dim light of the rising sun, she saw them, riders, dozens of them. They rose from the canyon like phantoms, their figures silhouetted against the orange sky. Horses moved in tight, silent formation. No shouting, no dust cloud. Just the steady, relentless drumbeat of hooves closing in. She gripped the rifle tighter, though she knew it would do no good. The first rider appeared past the corral, then another and another, until her ranch was encircled. Warriors, faces painted, feathers trailing in the wind. They didn't shout, they didn't raise their weapons, but their presence spoke volumes. Then she saw him, the wounded man. He sat atop a chestnut horse, upright but clearly weak. Blood still stained his sleeve. Yet there was a dignity to his posture, a silent command that the others seemed to respect. He dismounted slowly, favoring his good leg, and began to limp toward her. His gaze never wavered from hers. Hannah swallowed hard but didn't move. She couldn't have run if she tried. He stopped just a few feet away. The wind caught his hair, revealing the sharp lines of his face. Young, perhaps in his early 30s, but weathered by hardship, a scar ran along his jaw, like a blade had once kissed his skin and left its mark. His eyes held no rage, only something heavier, something older. He lifted his hand slowly and spoke one word. She gave. The warriors remained still, silent sentinels. The wounded man turned to them and spoke again in his own tongue. Low, firm, final. Whatever he said rippled through the group like a stone dropped in a still pond. Weapons were lowered. Eyes softened. A few of the warriors nodded. And then, just like that, they began to retreat. Silent shadows fading back into the morning mist, leaving behind only hoof prints in the dust. All except one. The wounded man. He limped past her, toward the barn, and without asking, sank down in the shade near the water trough. He leaned back against a wooden post and closed his eyes, as if he had always belonged there. Hannah stood frozen on the porch, the empty rifle clutched in her hands. The town would never believe this. They would call her mad, a traitor. They would say she had invited the devil into her home, but she hadn't invited anyone. She had given a dying man a sip of water. That was all. And now, somehow, it was everything. The day stretched out long and slow, the heat pressing down like an invisible hand. Hannah moved stiffly through her chores, always keeping one eye on the barn where the wounded Apache rested in the shade. He hadn't spoken again since the morning. Hadn't moved much either, though she saw him shift occasionally, adjusting his position with a grimace of pain. She half expected him to vanish like a ghost, or worse, to rise and turn against her. But he did neither. He simply remained, solid, silent, undeniable. By evening, the colors of the sky had bled into deep purples and burnt oranges. Hannah fed the chickens, or what few remained after the coyotes had their way last month, and filled a bucket from the last inch of water in the well. She debated whether to bring some to the man, then cursed herself for even hesitating. She filled the tin cup again, grabbed a clean rag from the wash basket, and approached him cautiously. His eyes opened as she drew near. Sharp and alert despite his injury, she knelt a few feet away, setting the cup and cloth down between them like a peace offering. "You should drink," she said, her voice rasping from disuse. He looked at the cup, then at her. For a moment, she thought he might refuse. Then slowly he reached out and took it. His fingers brushed hers briefly, rough and hot like sun-baked stone. He drank, only a few sips, and handed it back without a word. She picked up the rag, hesitated. "Your shoulder," she murmured. "It needs cleaning." He said nothing but didn't move away as she leaned in, dabbing gently at the wound. He flinched once, a sharp intake of breath through his teeth, but otherwise stayed still. Up close, she could see the old scars crisscrossing his skin beneath the blood and dust. Scars that spoke of battles fought long before he stumbled onto her land. When she finished, she sat back on her heels. "I don't even know your name," she said quietly. He stared at her for a long moment, then spoke, his voice low and rough. "Dakota," she nodded. "I'm Hannah." Neither said anything more. The evening deepened, and the first stars pricked the velvet sky. By unspoken agreement, he stayed near the barn that night. Hannah lay awake in her bed, the window cracked open to catch the faint breeze. She could hear the soft sounds of him moving now and then, a shifting of weight, a muted cough. She clutched James's old rifle to her chest, though she no longer knew if it was for protection or comfort. Morning came heavy and slow. Hannah rose before the sun, as always, and found Dakota already awake, sitting cross-legged by the dying embers of a fire he must have built from the scant scraps of wood she kept by the barn. She made coffee, thin and bitter from reused grounds, and set a tin cup near him without a word. He nodded in silent thanks and sipped it carefully, wincing as he moved his injured arm. The rhythm of life on the ranch resumed, altered but not shattered. Dakota moved stiffly but insisted on helping. He mended the broken fence she had struggled with, hammering nails one-handed with grim determination. He chopped wood in slow, deliberate motions. He even mucked out the chicken coop without being asked. Every time she tried to stop him, worried he would tear open his wound, he gave the same answer, spoken with quiet certainty. "You gave," I return. Days passed in this new, fragile balance. Hannah spoke little, so did Dakota. But the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was something else, something cautious but growing. Still, the world beyond her fence line did not forget. It was a Saturday when she rode into Dry Hollow, needing flour, coffee, and kerosene. The town was as dusty and tired as ever, but something in the air had shifted. Conversations hushed when she approached. People turned to stare. Men gathered outside the saloon muttered behind their hands. At the general store, she picked up a sack of flour and a tin of coffee. Mr. Jenkins, the owner, avoided her eyes as he rang up the sale. "Back from your secret war camp, Hannah?" A voice sneered from behind. She turned slowly to find 3 ranchers loitering by the ice house, Brody's men, if not Brody himself. They watched her with thinly veiled contempt. Another man muttered loud enough for her to hear, "Feeding him. Sleeping with him too, I bet." The words struck like a slap, but Hannah showed no reaction. She paid for her supplies, packed them onto her horse, and left without a backward glance. Outside, Sheriff Maddox was waiting. He was a big man, solid through the chest, with a walrus mustache and a look that said he'd rather be anywhere else. "Miss Moore," he said, touching the brim of his hat awkwardly, "we've had some concerns raised." "Concerns," she repeated flatly. "Folks say you're harboring an Apache on your land, feeding him, maybe more." She met his gaze without flinching. "I gave a wounded man water, that's all." He sighed, clearly wishing he could be anywhere but here. "Tensions are high, Hannah. People don't take kindly to certain things. I'd advise you to be careful." "I've been careful my whole life, Sheriff," she said. "It never made a damn bit of difference." He had no answer for that. That night, sitting on the porch with Dakota sharpening a knife nearby, Hannah told him what had happened in town. Her words came out hard and brittle, like stones being hurled into the dark. "They think I'm a traitor," she said. "Think I'm sleeping with you." Dakota didn't look up. He simply continued running the blade over the stone, slow and steady. "Aren't you going to say anything?" she demanded, half hoping he would deny it, explain it away. He tilted his head slightly, considering. "Words are smoke," he said finally. She almost laughed, half bitter, half broken. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one they'll run out of town." He stopped sharpening and looked at her then, his dark eyes serious. "You gave water to a dying man," he said. "That is not shame. That is root." "Root?" she echoed, confused. "In my people," he said slowly, "a woman who gives water gives life. Not just to the body, to the spirit." She stared at him, the night pressing in thick and close around them. "You gave what cannot be repaid." For a long time she said nothing. Then, very softly, she whispered, "You speak like someone who's lost more than blood." His eyes darkened, but he turned back to his knife without answering. And that was the end of it. For now, the days slid by, each one heavy with silence and the thick tension that had woven itself into every corner of the ranch. Hannah tried to pretend life was normal, that the routines of feeding the animals, hauling water, and mending fences were the same as they'd always been. But everything had shifted. Dakota's presence was like a shadow cast over every task. Not oppressive, but inescapable. Sometimes she would catch him watching her. Not in a way that made her skin crawl like the stares of some men back in town, but with a quiet attentiveness, as if memorizing how she moved through the world, as if trying to understand her. One afternoon, as she scrubbed mud from her boots by the porch, he limped over from the barn carrying a handful of wild herbs. He crouched awkwardly a few feet away, unwrapping the bundle and beginning to grind the leaves into a paste using 2 flat stones. Hannah wiped her hands on her skirt and watched curiously. "What are you doing?" she asked. He didn't look up. "For wound. Heal faster." She hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." Dakota gave a slight tilt of his head, an acknowledgement, not quite a smile, and continued working. She realized then how much pride he carried, even wounded. He hadn't once asked for help. Every act he offered was his own form of repayment, his own way of restoring a balance only he understood. The isolation grew thicker as the days wore on. No one came up the road to visit, no merchant wagons, no neighbors offering news or gossip. Dry Hollow had turned its back on her completely. Sunday morning came with the kind of brittle chill that hinted at the first breath of autumn. Hannah, driven by stubbornness more than faith, decided to attend the church service in town. She pulled on her best dress, pinned her hair neatly, and saddled the mule, leaving Dakota behind at the ranch. The ride into town felt longer than usual, each hoofbeat a drum roll of dread. When she stepped into the small white church, every conversation died mid-sentence. Heads turned. Mothers pulled their children closer. The preacher, a stooped man with thinning hair, offered a stilted nod before turning quickly back to his sermon notes. Hannah sat alone at the very back. When the hymns rose, no one offered her a hymnal. When the preacher spoke of charity and forgiveness, more than one person cast glances over their shoulders at her. It took every ounce of strength she had to sit through the service without bolting for the door. As soon as the final amen was spoken, she rose and walked out without waiting for the usual handshakes and forced smiles. Outside, the sun was high, glaring and unkind. She passed the blacksmith, who spit deliberately in the dust as she walked by. At the general store, Mrs. Connolly turned the sign to closed as Hannah approached. The message was clear: she wasn't welcome here anymore. When she finally reached her ranch, she found Dakota sitting by the well, sharpening a stick into a spear point. He didn't ask where she'd been. Didn't need to. The set of her shoulders, the tight line of her mouth told the whole story. She sank down onto the porch steps, exhaustion heavier than any weight she'd ever carried. After a long silence, Dakota spoke, his voice a low rumble. Harder to fight words than swords. She looked over at him, startled. It was one of the longest sentences he'd spoken yet. "They cut deeper," he added. Hannah gave a hollow laugh. "Maybe. Or maybe I've just gotten soft." He shook his head slowly. Not soft. Still standing, they sat together in the dying light, 2 survivors from 2 different wars, bound now by something neither fully understood. The world had turned against her, but here, on this strip of cracked earth, a wounded man had drawn an invisible line in the dust, and somehow she wasn't standing behind it alone. The first hint of danger came with the chickens. It was late, the sky bruised with heavy purple clouds, and Hannah had just settled by the fire with a book she hadn't touched in months. Outside, the chickens were restless, their clucks sharp and panicked, cutting through the stillness of the night. She frowned, setting the book aside, and rose to her feet. Dakota was already moving. She saw him cross the yard from the barn, silent as a shadow. His posture was tense, predatory, every step careful and deliberate. Hannah's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She grabbed the rifle leaning by the door, even though she still didn't know how to shoot it properly. The first shout shattered the night. "Come out, Red Lover!" A voice bellowed, thick with drink and rage. Hannah froze, the rifle clutched tightly in her hands. Lanterns bobbed in the darkness beyond the fence, swinging wildly with the movement of men. 5, maybe 6. Dakota melted into the shadows of the barn, invisible but present. Hannah edged back against the wall, peeking through the cracked door. A man kicked the chicken coop open, scattering feathers and terrified squawking hens into the night. Another man, tall and broad, with a dirty kerchief over his face, held a branding iron, its tip glowing red with heat. Hannah's stomach twisted into knots. They hadn't come just to scare her. They had come to destroy. The leader stepped forward, his silhouette unmistakable even in the dim light. Brody. Of course it was Brody. He had been circling her land for months like a vulture waiting for something to die. James had dealt with him in hushed conversations, promises, and threats woven together like barbed wire. And now that James was gone, Brody was free to take what he wanted, by persuasion if possible, by force if necessary. "I warned you, Hannah," Brody shouted, his voice thick with arrogance. "You lie down with savages, you lose more than chickens." She opened her mouth to reply, but before she could find the words, the barn doors burst open. Dakota moved like a force of nature. No shouting, no warning. One moment he was part of the night, the next he was a blur of motion, bone and blade flashing under the lantern light. The man with the branding iron didn't even have time to raise his weapon before Dakota slammed into him, wrenching the iron from his grasp and sending it skittering into the dirt. Another man swung a club, but Dakota ducked low and drove his shoulder into the man's stomach, sending him sprawling with a heavy grunt. A third man tried to draw a pistol, but Dakota knocked it away with a brutal backhanded strike that left the man gasping in the dirt. The fight was over almost as quickly as it had begun. 4 men lay moaning on the ground, clutching broken arms and bleeding noses. The fifth turned and fled into the night, his lantern swinging wildly behind him. Dakota stood still for a moment, breathing hard, the knife in his hand dripping with blood. Not much, but enough to make Hannah's knees go weak. He turned toward her, his face unreadable in the flickering light. "I stay," he said simply, "until all danger sleeps." Hannah could only nod, her throat too tight for words. By morning, the broken men were gone. She hadn't asked where Dakota had taken them. She hadn't asked how none of them had died, despite the violence. But she had seen the way he fought, with precision, not cruelty. Death had brushed close enough to be felt, then pulled back at the last moment. Mercy, perhaps, or a warning. The town buzzed with whispers by midday. Sheriff Maddox arrived with 2 deputies, dust coating their horses' legs and grim lines etched deep into their faces. They stopped at the edge of her property, wary, uncertain. Hannah met them on the porch, the old rifle cradled in her arms more as a symbol than a threat. Maddox dismounted, removing his hat. "Miss Moore," he said carefully, "we heard there was an attack." "I'm alive," she replied, her voice steady. He shifted his weight, glancing toward the barn where Dakota worked, hammering a new plank into the fence as if nothing had happened. "Was it true?" Maddox asked. "Were they after him?" Hannah said nothing. The deputy to his left, a younger man with a mean squint, stepped forward. "She's harboring a savage. They were protecting us." "Protecting me?" Hannah snapped, stepping off the porch. "By burning my land? By trying to brand me like cattle?" The deputy opened his mouth to retort, but Maddox held up a hand. "I can't protect you if you don't." "I never asked for your protection," she cut in sharply. A tense silence fell. The wind stirred the dust at their boots. The younger deputy muttered, "You're putting us all at risk, woman. Apache, don't stay grateful for long." From the shadows behind the barn, Dakota appeared. No weapon in hand, no threat, just his silent, steady presence. The deputy stiffened, hands twitching toward their holsters. "Stand down!" Maddox barked, his voice slicing through the tension. Dakota raised his hands slowly, palms out, and stepped back into the shadows again. Maddox looked at Hannah with something like regret. "You've got to choose," he said, "the town or him. You can't have both." She didn't flinch. "I never wanted either," she said. They left after that, but not without glances over their shoulders. Glances that promised more trouble to come. That evening, Hannah sat by the fire, arms wrapped tightly around herself. The walls of the house, once comforting, now felt too thin, too fragile. "You shouldn't have come out," she told Dakota quietly. "You gave them more reasons to hate." He stirred the fire with a stick, the flames snapping and spitting. "They do not need reasons," he said. "Only excuses." She stared at the flickering light, her chest tight with anger and fear. "I used to believe this land was my home," she whispered. "Now I'm not sure it was ever mine." Dakota looked at her then, his face softened by firelight. "Home is not place," he said. "It is choice." She blinked, the weight of those words settling heavy on her heart. "And what if I chose wrong?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. He was quiet for a long time. "Then we fight for it." The warning came with the night wind. Hannah woke to the distant sound of boots on dirt, the low murmur of voices, the creak of old wood under rough hands. Her heart leapt into her throat. She grabbed the rifle by the door, still useless in her hands, but somehow necessary, and peered out the window. 5 men. Lanterns bobbed in their fists, guns gleaming under the sickle moon. One man, face hidden under a wide-brimmed hat, held a length of rope. Another carried a branding iron, still red from the fire. The barn doors shook under a heavy blow. Chickens scattered, squawking and flapping. Someone laughed, a harsh, ugly sound, and a second blow splintered the old wood. "Come out, red lover," a voice jeered. "We're here to finish what we started." Hannah's hands trembled around the rifle. She backed away from the door, her mind racing. Dakota, where was he? Before she could think, before she could shout, the barn doors burst open. Flames leapt into the night. The bastards had set the straw inside ablaze. Smoke billowed thick and choking, and the horses screamed in terror from the corral. Hannah stumbled onto the porch, coughing, eyes watering, the rifle clutched uselessly in her hands. That's when she saw him. Dakota moved through the smoke like a wraith, low and fast. He didn't charge blindly. He struck like lightning, silent, devastating. The first man never saw him coming. A sharp crack echoed as Dakota drove a knee into his side, sending him sprawling into the dirt. The second swung a club, but Dakota ducked, grabbed the man's wrist and twisted. Bone snapped with a sickening pop, and the branding iron fell into the dust. The third man managed to fire his pistol once, the shot going wide before Dakota slammed him backward into the water trough with a splash. The fourth man hesitated, long enough for Dakota to close the distance. He swept the man's legs out from under him and drove him face first into the ground. Only Brody remained, standing at the edge of the chaos, his pistol raised and shaking. "You think you can scare me, savage?" Brody spat. "You think you can steal what's mine?" Dakota said nothing. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate. Brody pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, deafening. Dakota jerked slightly but kept moving, a dark stain spreading across the shoulder of his shirt. Brody cursed, fumbling to cock the pistol again, but Dakota was already on him. He struck Brody's wrist with the butt of his knife, sending the pistol flying. Then he grabbed the front of Brody's shirt and shoved him backward against the fence, hard enough to make the wood creak. For a moment they were frozen there, Brody gasping, Dakota looming over him like judgment made flesh. "Enough," Dakota said, his voice low and final. Brody spat blood into the dirt, his eyes wild with hatred. "This ain't over, Redskin," he hissed. That's when Hannah stepped forward, the rifle leveled, her hands no longer shaking. "You're right," she said coldly. "It's just beginning." Brody looked at her, truly looked at her, maybe for the first time. He saw it then, the steel beneath the dirt, the fire behind the tired eyes. Not a woman to be pitied, not a woman to be bought or bullied, a woman who had chosen her ground and would not be moved. Brody sneered, then staggered back into the darkness, leaving his broken men behind him. The fire in the barn sputtered and died, smothered by smoke and dirt and Dakota's quick work with the water barrels. The air reeked of burnt wood and fear. By dawn, the yard was a battlefield of broken lanterns, trampled dust, and bloodied footprints. Hannah sat on the porch steps, wrapping Dakota's wound with trembling hands. He flinched once, but otherwise said nothing, letting her work. "You're hurt," she whispered. He shrugged with one shoulder. Still standing, she bit her lip to keep from crying. "I'm sorry," she said fiercely. "This is my fault. I should have left." He caught her wrist, his grip firm but gentle. "You gave water," he said. "You gave life, not fault." She looked at him then, really looked. The scar along his jaw, the blood at his shoulder, the quiet strength in his eyes. Somewhere between the broken fence and the burned barn, something had changed. Something had rooted itself deep inside her chest, and she knew, with a certainty stronger than fear, that she wasn't standing alone anymore. Not ever again. The attic was thick with dust, the kind that clung to your skin and filled your nose no matter how shallowly you breathed. Hannah pulled aside an old trunk, the wood dry and splintering beneath her fingers. James's things had sat untouched for nearly a year, gathering the weight of silence and forgetting. She didn't know what drew her up here that afternoon. Restlessness, maybe. Or the gnawing sense that something had been left undone, unsaid. The trunk creaked open, revealing a tangle of memories. An old jacket, a pair of worn boots, a cracked shaving mirror. At the bottom, tucked into a folded blanket, she found it, a letter, sealed in an envelope so stained and brittle it looked ready to crumble at her touch. Her name wasn't on it. Brody's was. Frowning, she unfolded the paper, the script familiar and painful at once. To Mr. Brody. As discussed, I agree to the sale of the property at the offered price. Once my wife is informed, I expect discretion until the paperwork is finalized. She's not ready to let go, but I am. James Moore, the words blurred before her eyes. She sank onto the floor, the letter clutched in her shaking hands. James hadn't planned to stay. Not with her. Not with the land. He'd been ready to sell everything they'd built together, behind her back without a second thought, and to Brody of all people. A deep, hollow ache opened up inside her chest, swallowing the air. For a long time she sat there, the weight of betrayal pressing her into the dust. Finally she stood. Her hands no longer trembled. Her heart, though cracked and battered, burned with something fierce and bright. She wasn't going to run. She wasn't going to hide. Not anymore. That evening she saddled her horse under the low slant of the setting sun. Dakota watched from the porch, his expression unreadable. "Going to town," she said simply. He stepped forward, one hand resting lightly on the saddle horn. "Danger there." She met his gaze without flinching. "Danger here, too." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Dakota gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "I go," he said. She smiled faintly. "I know." They rode side by side into the gathering dusk, the wheels of fate turning with every hoofbeat. Dry Hollow looked the same on the surface. Dusty streets, tired storefronts, the low murmur of voices drifting from the saloon. But Hannah could feel the tension crackling in the air, see it in the way men stiffened and turned as she passed. They gathered in the town square, drawn by the scent of blood and spectacle. Brody was already there, standing near the courthouse steps with his men fanned out behind him like a pack of jackals. His smile when he saw her was slow and oily. "Well, well," he drawled. "Look who found her nerve." She ignored him, riding straight to the courthouse steps where Judge Leland waited, his spectacles glinting in the fading light. "You said you'd look into it," she said, her voice carrying in the stillness. The judge nodded slowly. He held up a worn folder thick with papers. "I did. There is no record of a sale, Miss Moore. No deed transfer, no signed agreement." Brody's face twisted into a snarl. "We had a deal. Her husband promised." "A promise is not a deed," the judge said sharply, "and the law does not honor whispers made behind closed doors." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Brody stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "She's lying. That letter could be forged. She's keeping an Apache on her land, for God's sake. Who knows what else she's capable of?" Eyes turned toward Dakota, who stood quietly at the edge of the square, arms crossed, watching. Someone muttered savage under their breath. Another spit into the dust. The air grew thicker, sharper, the way it did before a storm broke. Brody's hand twitched toward his belt. Before Hannah could shout a warning, before anyone could move, Brody yanked a pistol from his holster and leveled it at her chest. Time seemed to fracture. The crowd gasped. The judge shouted. But Dakota moved faster than thought. He was a blur, crossing the space between them in a heartbeat. His hand clamped down on Brody's wrist, forcing the barrel skyward just as the pistol discharged. The shot cracked like thunder, harmless this time, but deafening. Dakota wrenched the gun free and slammed Brody to the ground with brutal efficiency, one knee on his chest, one hand pinning his arm. For a long, frozen moment, no one breathed. Then Judge Leland found his voice. "Enough!" he bellowed. "Stand down, all of you." Dakota looked to Hannah. She nodded once and he rose, releasing Brody with a contemptuous shove. Brody lay in the dirt, gasping like a fish, his pride bleeding out faster than his breath. Judge Leland addressed the crowd, his voice firm and final. "There will be no more claims against Miss Moore's land. The property is legally hers. Anyone who challenges that will answer to the law." Murmurs again, some resentful, some grudging, a few even approving. Hannah stood tall, the letter tucked safely in her pocket, her heart hammering with the slow realization that she had won. Not just the land, not just her freedom, but the right to stand unbroken in the face of everything they had tried to take from her. As the crowd dispersed, some with nods, others with glares, Dakota stepped to her side. She looked up at him, 1,000 unspoken things passing between them in the space of a breath. "Thank you," she said quietly. He shook his head once. "No thanks," he murmured. "You fought." And somehow that meant more than anything. They rode home under a sky streaked with stars, the land unfolding before them like a promise. At the ranch, the scars of battle were still visible, the burned barn, the battered fences, the scorched earth, but they were hers. And she would rebuild, not alone, never alone again. That night, as the fire crackled low and the cicadas sang their endless song, Hannah sat beside Dakota on the porch, a mug of bitter coffee warming her hands. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly, not sure if she meant the fight, the risk, or something deeper. Dakota was silent for a long time, then he said, "No, some things are worth standing for." She nodded, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. The night air smelled of smoke and hope. And for the first time in a long, long while, Hannah Moore believed she could breathe easy again. The days after the confrontation in Dry Hollow unfurled slowly, like a long-held breath finally released. The town, wounded in its pride and shaken by its failure, turned inward. The whispers did not stop, but they softened, dulled by the undeniable truth that Hannah Moore had stood her ground and won. No one challenged her ownership again. No one dared. The silence of the town was not kind, but it was survivable. Hannah focused on the land, throwing herself into the endless small tasks that rebuilt the ranch piece by piece. She patched the barn roof with salvaged wood. She mended the fences with Dakota's quiet help. Together, they cleared away the debris left by the fires, dug fresh post holes, hammered new nails into sun-bleached beams. They worked mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable kind of quiet, thick with unspoken understanding. Dakota never entered the house without permission, and even then, he moved with a kind of reverence, as if the four walls were a sacred space. He slept in the barn still, on a bed of hay and blankets she had quietly made a little more comfortable each day. Hannah found herself noticing small things about him. The way he always waited for her to take the first bite at meals, the way he polished her boots without ever being asked, the way he tended the horses with a gentleness that belied the scars on his hands. One evening, after a long day of repairing the chicken coop, she found him sitting by the fire, carving something from a piece of driftwood he had found near the creek. The flames cast long shadows across his face, softening the hard lines, illuminating the quiet concentration in his eyes. She approached slowly, drawn by curiosity and something deeper, something unnamed. "What are you making?" she asked, settling down across from him. He did not look up. "Memory," he said simply. "For who?" He hesitated, the knife pausing mid-stroke. "For you." Her breath caught, but she said nothing, watching the way his hands moved, sure and steady, shaping the wood into something rough but beautiful. "You gave me water," he said, his voice low. "Then you gave me choice." She tilted her head. "What choice?" "To stay." The words settled between them like the first drop of rain after a long drought. They didn't speak much after that. They didn't need to. The bond between them was not woven from conversation, but from shared silences, from glances across the field, from the simple, stubborn act of enduring side by side. One morning, as the air grew crisper and the leaves began to curl at the edges, signaling the slow turn toward autumn, Hannah found a small bundle wrapped in cloth on her windowsill. Inside was a necklace, beads of bone and turquoise, strung together with careful hands, and at the center, a single raven feather and a stone carved into the shape of a wave. She traced it with trembling fingers, feeling the smoothness of the beads, the cool weight of the stone. When she stepped outside, she found Dakota near the corral, repairing a broken latch. She held the necklace out toward him, her hands unsteady. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "What does it mean?" He straightened, wiping his hands on his pants, and looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. "Water is more than survival," he said. "It is spirit. Memory, or bond between two lives." She touched the stone again, her throat tight. "And this?" He smiled, just the faintest curve of his lips. "It means you are not alone." Tears stung her eyes before she could stop them. "I choose," she said, voice breaking. He nodded once, solemn and sure, and she slipped the necklace over her head, the beads settling against her heart like a promise. From that day on, something shifted between them. Not dramatic, not spoken, but real. Dakota built a small shelter near the barn, sturdy and weatherproof, though he still often fell asleep under the stars. Hannah began setting two places at the table without thinking. Sometimes she found herself reaching for him in small ways, a hand on his arm when she laughed, a brush of shoulders when they worked side by side. He never pulled away. Neither did she. The townsfolk, sensing the new order of things, adjusted in their own cautious ways. Mrs. Connolly, the storekeeper's wife, left a basket of eggs on Hannah's porch one morning, no note, but a tentative olive branch nonetheless. A little girl, no more than 6, placed a bunch of wildflowers on the fence post, darting away before Hannah could thank her. Sheriff Maddox rode by once, touching the brim of his hat in silent greeting before moving on without a word. It wasn't acceptance, not fully, but it was something. And for now, that was enough. One evening, after the chores were done and the sun was bleeding gold into the horizon, Hannah found Dakota sitting by the well, staring into its dark depths. She approached quietly, the dry grass whispering under her boots. He didn't look up. "This is where it began," he said. She sat beside him, knees brushing, heart hammering in her chest. "I was ready to die here," he continued, voice low and rough. "And you gave me life." She swallowed hard. "I didn't do much." He turned to her then, his gaze steady and unflinching. "You did everything. The words hit her with the force of a rising tide, washing away years of loneliness, fear, and doubt. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached for his hand. Dakota didn't hesitate. His fingers curled around hers, calloused and warm, anchoring her to the earth, to the moment, to him. They sat like that for a long time, the stars wheeling slowly overhead, the wind whispering promises in the dark. Home, she realized, wasn't the ranch. It wasn't the land or the house or the fences. Home was a choice. And she had chosen. Weeks slipped into months. The ranch healed. The chickens clucked contentedly in their new coop. The horses grew fat and glossy under Dakota's careful hands. The well, blessedly, filled again after a season of steady rains. Hannah and Dakota moved through their days like two halves of the same heartbeat, different but in rhythm, bound by something stronger than words. One crisp morning, as the first frost kissed the edges of the fields, Hannah found Dakota waiting for her by the porch steps. He held out his hand. She took it without hesitation. Together they walked to the ridge overlooking the ranch, the place where Hannah had first seen him crumpled in the dirt, bleeding and broken. The land stretched out before them, vast and wild and breathtakingly beautiful. Dakota pointed toward the horizon, where a hawk soared high against the endless blue. "You are like her," he said softly. Hannah smiled, tears blurring her vision. "Strong wings," he added, "strong heart." She squeezed his hand, her chest aching with gratitude and love so fierce it threatened to undo her. "And you," she whispered, "you are my root." He turned to her, his expression open and raw in a way she had rarely seen. "And you are my sky," he said. They stood there, two survivors, two fighters, two souls stitched together by blood, sweat, and the simplest, purest acts of kindness. And when the wind rose, carrying the scent of earth and water and life itself, they stood together, unshaken. Because sometimes the strongest bonds are not forged in fire or blood. Sometimes they are born in silence, nurtured in patience, and sealed with a single cup of water offered beneath a burning sun. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness, a sip of water, a helping hand, can change the course of two lives forever. Hannah Moore didn't just save a man that day. She built a bridge between two worlds with nothing but courage and compassion. In a time filled with fear and division, she proved that true strength isn't measured by who you can fight, but by who you choose to stand beside. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join our community. We share true stories of resilience, honor, and hope because the world needs more of them now than ever. We'll see you in the next story.